Ella. The presentation, as usual with these groups, will be recorded. So if you don't want to be on the recording, just please note that. We will be using our standard structure of a presentation for about 25 minutes on the chapter that has been shared beforehand with you all. And then we'll be hearing a response. Today the response is from Emma Tomalin from the University of Leeds. And then we will be opening up for general question and answer to take us to the top of the hour. Yeah, thank you everyone for joining. Without further ado, let me hand over to Ella. And Ella, if you are ready to share your screen, I'll let you introduce yourself. Actually, sorry, I've just forgotten. I've not introduced you, but I will let you introduce yourself and then we can start. So over to you, Ella. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And thank you for this opportunity to share my work with you. And I'm an anthropologist by training. And just recently I joined the Institute for Sociology at the Slovak Academy of Sciences, where I moved from Maynooth University in Ireland, where I worked as a lecturer. And the work I will be presenting today is the work I have been working on for quite a while. It started as my PhD project and then got also some other second and third lives as well. And this project is like the work I'm presenting today is part of the larger project on what used to be called and perhaps still is sometimes called new donors, new European donors, or reinventing donors of Eastern Europe, who after the EU accession had to reconstruct and rebuild their new foreign aid institutions, because the structures they had from the socialist era were dissolved and were not fit for the EU regime. So I've been investigating that process by following the re-emergence of Poland in Africa after the EU accession. And this is part of this, what I'm presenting today is part of this research. So in 2008, I had an opportunity to shadow one of the most prominent humanitarians in Poland as she was traveling to South Sudan, where her organization was establishing its very first permanent mission in Africa. We got on a plane early in Warsaw, and after one stopover and a 13-hour direct flight, we finally arrived in Entebbe airport. Our next plane to Juba was scheduled for the next day around 11 a.m. It was after midnight, so I asked what the plan was, if the hotel was far away. She gave me a stern look and scolded me. What do you expect? A night in a hotel? There are better ways to spend money than on unjustified luxuries. If the people we are going to help have no roofs over their heads, why should we? If you can't spend a night sleeping rough in the airport, how do we expect to survive in Bor? Wanda picked up her large backpack and began to wander around the airport. I followed her apathetically. Finally, she stopped under a staircase and decided that that would be our den for the night. As we lay down on the floor, I tried to get some sleep, but also make sense of what just happened. Why being a good humanitarian requires sleeping on the floor? The next day, on Sunday, we finally arrived in Juba. As soon as we landed, Wanda said she would like to go to church. It was not a suggestion, as she was not gauging the interest among others if they're willing to go. Her "I would like to go to church" strongly resonated with my memories of childhood Sundays and equivalent conversations with my mom, aunties, or grandma, in which I meant we, and everything seemed certain. There was no room for negotiation. At the same time, Wanda's announcement surprised me. I knew she was Catholic, but I also remembered her repeated statements in which she emphasized secular character of the NGO. In her guidelines for staff members, she strongly recommended that aid workers should not manifest their religious affiliation in any way. She discouraged pendants, crucifix necklaces, or any other forms of religious manifestation. Now she was openly suggesting a trip to church. Once the mass was over, Wanda asked for a meeting with the priest. Half an hour later, we found ourselves sitting in the porch of his office with Wanda asking dozens of questions about the politics, life, history, economy, and the needs of the local people. She was noting all the answers religiously. So what does our sleepover at the airport have to do with the church visit and the meeting with the priest? Seemingly nothing, but as I will demonstrate in this paper, the two events are the best exemplification of the ways in which Catholic values and institutions shape Poland's emergence as a donor. The specific situation of emerging donors, which in the past decade were building aid institutions from scratch, as I mentioned, facilitates an unprecedented opportunity to learn about the ways in which foreign aid institutions are built. And I describe that process in my book. And in this book, I demonstrate that in order to emerge as a donor, what is needed is the establishment of moral foundations and political discourses about caring about the distant. In order to convince the public about the necessity to share the wealth with others, with foreign strangers, sentiments and fantasies about the worlds of those who supposedly require international assistance must be mobilized. A connection must be created. Today, I want to talk about the role of religion in that process. I demonstrate how strongly those supposedly secular, modernist moralities are in fact shaped by religious ideas of charity with specifically Catholic connotations. And I speak about Polish situation, so I do not make universal claims that it's everywhere Catholic or religious. When Poland took its very first step as the EU donor, the country's main interest, as you can see in that slide, these were the very first years of Polish activities as aid donor. So the Polish interest, as you can see, was in Belarus, Ukraine, Eastern Europe. And there was no problem in generating support for those sort of activities. Nationalism played a strong role in mobilizing this trajectory. These are basically the closest Eastern neighbors for Poland. Parts of those regions used to be pre-war connected to Poland through the history and Poland used to, the borders were different pre-war, so there was a lot of sentiments about these are our lands, our people, we share common Slovak history, not Slovak, but Slavonic history. And also there was a lot of nationalistic nostalgia, which resonated ideas about Poland as this great nation of like a resistant country, the country which stands up to oppression, to regime due to solidarity movements, but also earlier history. And so now the sentiment was that Poland has to share the know-how and help younger brothers in the revolutions. So there was no, like, it seemed, as people would tell me, this is natural direction for Polish. That was the view in the country. But for partners in the Western Europe, for the EU officials, that was not accepted, and that was seen as an aggravation. It was a signal that this is lack of understanding of what foreign aid is, and so-called established Western donors argued that Poland should get involved in Africa. But the problem was that except for very few activists in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and in NGOs, no one really cared about Africa. No one wanted to either locate funding there or get involved in any projects. It was a big struggle to convince the public about the necessity to assist Africa. And there were two ways of mobilizing that aid, of convincing the public about this need for politicians. And one way was to use the vehicle of legal argument and basically shame our people in Poland by saying we are members of the EU and we are obliged to act as Westerners, and this is what Westerners do, so we have to do it. Or to use the legal argument by saying, as a member of the EU, we have signed certain international treaties, hence we have to follow those treaties, and we have to keep the promise that we have given. But this rhetoric proved quite ineffective, The only thing that worked were narratives like this piece that I found in one of the funding applications made to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for funding. There's probably no bigger necessity than care for vulnerable people. Often they're abandoned because they bring no benefits to the family and instead are a burden. But also most of the families are completely hopeless. The region is completely forgotten. The village is located in the bush. There is no electricity. People have no resources to live on. There is no work. There are no prospects for normal living. People are abandoned and left on their own. This project, because this is part of the grant application, funding application, would be a sort of miracle for the local people. For them, the involvement of any organization in the area equals protection of their daily lives. Development of the village and the region. Everyone is praying for our arrival. We believe that with the aid of sensitive and reasonable people, meaning the people who are reading that application, it will be possible to open the center as soon as possible. Here, not much is needed to arrange things. The locals are very helpful and generous. However, on this funding depends solely whether the project is realized. So one of my questions was, why do such narratives work? Why these narratives were successful in generating funding? Here I will show today that they work because they resonate very well with known and internalized Catholic ideas about inequality and suffering and what can be done about it. The theological principles of Christian charity are based on the perception of the world as imperfect, as a fallen world. As a consequence of this view, Catholics must take care of those poor and vulnerable who suffer the hardships. In this view, misery is natural and it is inherent part of the social order. This framing of suffering as human condition masks the role of people and states in shaping this misery. And it suggests that existing problems are almost impossible to change. However, the only thing that can be done is charitable action. This form of reasoning is particularly visible in the Polish variant of humanitarianism. Just like Catholic charity, humanitarian endeavor's primary goal is to evoke feelings of empathy among the public or ministerial evaluators who allocate the funding. The goal is also to foster the feelings of guilt among decision makers, suggesting their responsibility for the future of chosen community if they reject the application. This shift in emphasis from the deserving poor to the suffering and their suffering to donors transforms foreign problems into an issue which can be and should be acted upon. It is no longer about them, it is about us who should do something. Now the move towards action is possible. In Catholicism, action is taken up by the missionary work. In humanitarian world, this task is the role of foreign aid. In Catholicism, missionary work is organized around three types of sacrifice: that of poor, that of congregations, and that of missionaries. Now I will show how these specific conceptualizations of missionary work were directly translated into the ways in which foreign aid was envisioned in Poland and conceptualized, and the meanings were loaded in the early 2000s. So first, the sacrifice of the poor. In my example, this type of sacrifice is particularly visible in the emphasis on the suffering of villagers, but also when they are defined as generous, ready to make further sacrifices. It is idealized poverty. Those who suffer are innocent, good, generous. They are deserving poor, who with hope await assistance. What is reproduced here is very like the image of pure victims waiting for some sort of miracle. They are cursed and holy at the same time. The sacrifice of the generation in this project proposal quoted here is visible in the way we hear the evocation of the sensitive and reasonable people is made. That is the project evaluators. But this rhetoric of sacrifice made by congregation is also reflected in the general discourses about Poland's transition from being recipient to donor. These discourses acknowledge difficult situation in the country, but insist on the necessity to share the limited wealth with others. So here, there was, at the time of Polish emergence as a donor, there was an annual poll conducted, a survey of people's attitudes towards aid. And you can see here one of the questions: why do you think Poland should not help others? Which reflects the view that Poland is still a poor country. It was just after the EU accession, that Poland has struggled through tremendous economic crisis only recently. So how do you convince people in that position that they should share their private wealth, the taxes, with distant strangers in Africa? So people were looking for arguments, those organized the polls wanted to understand that, and it is clear that people see themselves as in need. It's the country is still suffering, but yet there is an idea that we, in spite of this suffering, we should help others, but also because we know what it means to be at the receiving aid. So and we benefited from others, so helping us. So that's why we should share our wealth. Sorry. And then there's finally the sacrifice of missionaries. Finally, the emerging moral economy of Polish aid to Africa is also strongly influenced by the third pillar of missionary dogma, that concerning the sacrifice of missionaries. That is why we had to sleep at the airport. Wanda and her NGO was a champion of the idea that the aid work is a form of sacrifice. That is the first and foremost form of moral labor. Wanda, the NGO president, argued that being an aid worker requires modesty and frugality. The salaries in her organizations were significantly lower than in other NGOs, not just Western, also Eastern European. All non-projects related expenses had to be constantly negotiated. You can see here, this is the mission site in South Sudan, and all those tents are the second-hand tents from the UN. This is where the quarters of the NGO workers, and the hut that you can see at the very end of this little plot was built only 1 year into being on the site. So there was no any, comparing to other ways in which other NGOs work, that was very, very modest. Even such essential purchase as a car was not an obvious expense. And for a long time, Wanda was hesitant to grant Sudanese mission that privilege. So in South Sudan, aid workers operated without any car for more than a year. A story was circulating among paying aid workers that Wanda refused to grant permission to buy beds for the aid workers in Chechnya, as supposedly this would elevate the standard of living far above that of the local people. For Wanda, the sacrifice of her workers was motivated by the need to build a certain image among aid recipients in the host country. But I argue that the suffering of her aid workers was a crucial characteristic that encouraged people at home in Poland to support her endeavors and those of her organization. It is sympathy for hardworking people, Polish people, rather than a concern with the suffering of distant strangers in Africa, that eventually allowed Wanda and her NGO to consolidate public support in Poland for their work. But the link between the church and the Polish emergence as a donor has also a more earthy dimension. It is quite pragmatic. Between 2005 and 2010, around 60% of African projects financed by the MFA were implemented by Catholic associations or by secular NGOs whose local partners was Polish Catholic missionary working in Africa. In the case of aid projects implemented by Polish embassies in Africa, virtually all projects were undertaken by Polish missionaries. There are several reasons for the high presence of missionary actors in aid initiatives. During socialist era, Poland had considerably decent relations with African states. Poland was part of the Comecon and had cooperated with African nations as part of the Soviet bloc, competing together with Soviets against Western bloc for the decolonizing states. And however, since 1989, all those connections were cut, and they were seen as the reminiscence of socialism and inappropriate, unmodern, backward, and they had to be forgotten. New actors had a limited confidence in operating in the region, and they had no connections. Missionaries then became an only and the first contact point on the ground, as we saw in the case of Janka and her visit in church and later with the priest. In practical terms, enjoying the status of local partners on the African continent, church agents, Polish priests became gatekeepers and facilitated the emergence of Polish donors in distant territories. And here you can see, I don't know how I stand with time. Yes.
About 3 minutes.
Okay, so I will, this is an interesting image because it shows Polish nuns who are very famous for taking care of blind children in Poland, and they use all their know-how and knowledge and translate and moved to Rwanda and also to India to conduct exactly the same practices there. And here they are visited by the Minister of Foreign Affairs. No, that's Tusk. This was the prime minister at that time. So missionaries are gatekeepers, but what is very important, they are also our missionaries. The fact that missionaries were associated with Africa, were representing Poland, allowed for the embodiment of national ambitions, even in a region that was perceived as the most irrelevant for national affairs. The distribution of aid through Polish missionaries allowed a shortening of the distance between Poland and Africa. The specific national rationale resulted in the conceptualization of missionaries instead of local people as the aid recipients. This conceptualization frees aid supporters from the necessity to imagine the others in the humanitarian, and it allows them to concentrate on the familiar folk from home. The inclusion of missionaries in the aid circle allows Poles to overcome the difficulties in legitimizing Polish aid to Africa. With time, as the process of emergence as a donor progresses, the same logic has been applied to aid workers. It is our Polish organizations, our Polish aid workers like Wanda, rather than distant strangers that people want to support. Now to conclusions. As I have shown in this paper, the aid gaze and the moral economy of foreign aid does not emerge in a cultural vacuum. In Poland, it is influenced by Catholic philanthropic reason. It internalizes the Catholic perception of charity and poverty. However, the current regime of neutrality in foreign aid and the dominant ideals of professional aid practice results in the formation of anti-religious politics in the aid movement and presentation of it as de-religionalized. Never can pronounce it. Significantly, secular organizations that use missionaries as gatekeepers and cooperate with them owned these partnerships in official communications, emphasizing the pure aid aspect of the work. So it was very interesting for me when I was doing that research that it was a lot of excavating to actually realize these are Catholic actors who actively relate to Catholicism, but they mask that. They don't want in their public communication to reveal that information. Similarly, religious organizations push their religious aspects to the background, fashioning themselves as professional aid workers. Effectively, both sides carefully craft the image as non-religious, neutral organizations, as their organizations as established humanitarian, as their recognition as established humanitarians depends on the success of their secular and professional rather than religious representation. Oh, pardon. As a result of this process, we arrive at this paradoxical situation in which the public support for Polish emergence as an EU donor can be only generated through the mobilization of the pre-existing Catholic moralities. However, in order to be recognized by the Western partners as the established and professional donors, these religious aspects of humanitarianism must fade into the background. What comes to the fore are institutional and so-called objective aid systems and rational technologies of what I call bureaucratic activism, but that's a different paper. So thank you very much, and I look forward to commentary and questions.
Thank you very much, Ella. Yes, Great, quite a challenging ideas at some points there, you know, the idea of sacrifice, and we've already got a comment here I see in the chat about some of the theology, and I'm sure from, you know, the professional humanitarians perspective as well, they might have some pushback on some of those ideas of sacrifice and how some of the operations of the organization that you looked at were working. But what I'm going to do before I say too much is hand over to Emma. Emma, if you're ready to unmute and to go ahead for your response to Ella's presentation.
Oh, right, here we go. Let's do the video as well. Oh, you've got me. Excellent, excellent. Great. Okay, so yeah, thanks Olivia for inviting me to respond to the chapter, and also Ella for writing the chapter. It was really interesting. I enjoyed it very much, and I haven't had a chance to read the whole book yet, but I will do as soon as I can. Olivia, how long do I have?
Go for 10 minutes.
Oh, yep. Okay, that's perfect. That's perfect. Okay, so I'm going to pick up actually where you left off, Ella, and some of the things that I've pulled out from the chapter are actually very different to the things you've emphasised. So if other people have read the chapter, then that's probably a good thing. But I was very much reading it as someone who works on religion and humanitarianism and development, and there were a number of things that really stood out to me, 4 areas, in fact, that I'm going to highlight that I think show how this book, or this chapter at least, fits within, you know, broader current concerns and debates within academia and also within the sector. So first of all, this is where you left off. I found this discussion of the strategic suppression of religious identities very relevant to current debates, and they're certainly ones that I've been engaging with in my own publications. So debates about the diverse ways in which faith actors relate to the ostensibly secular humanitarian and development sector. And what I think the chapter illustrated really well, and through the discussion of Wanda from Paine, was how many faith actors actually end up shifting register between, and this is to quote from your chapter, so between the active manifestation of their religious affiliations, as in contrast with their public declarations of the non-religious character of the NGOs and their actions. So you write in your chapter, and you talked just now about how they were masking religion, but you write that many of these organisations are struggling to establish themselves as respectful aid actors, especially in regard to their Western colleagues. The Polish aid workers are making every effort to follow the path set up by established donors and to meet the standards of rational, professional, neutral and modern age, cleansed of religious zeal and driven by humanitarian rather than religious ethics. But at the same time, of course, we see Wanda in terms of her private faith outlook. She was very keen to attend church in Juba, but not just then to use this event as an expression of her personal religiosity, but also to connect with the nuns and priests and to ask very practical questions about the local community. And I think what I'd say here and just emphasize is that I think we need more of this kind of study that moves beyond thinking about the religion and humanitarian nexus as either wholly religious at one end of the spectrum, you know, for instance, this very essentialized view of faith actors as only or mainly involved in order to gain converts, and then as completely secular at the other end. So we have this neutral humanitarian sector devoid of cultural or religious influence. And this kind of research that you've undertaken not only, I think, tells us more about the reality of the religion humanitarian nexus, but is also, I think, a really excellent domain to test out and revise theories in the sociology of religion regarding these really important debates around secularization and the post-secular and so on. So, you know, great to read this, and I'd love to see more of it. So moving to my second point, I then also found it really interesting that Paine goes even further in the masking of any religious influence, in not even identifying as a faith-based organisation. And again, to quote from you, they forged hardly any partnerships with religious organisations while actively cooperating with other secular NGOs. And this is, of course, despite the really strong impact of Catholicism in the lives of many of the staff, and as well as the public who support them, and of course indicates the very strategic ways in which this label FBO, or even just the description to be faith-based, or not to be faith-based, or not to describe yourself as faith-based, is used in very strategic ways by different actors. And again, I think this feeds really well into current debates about the extent to which individual organisations can be viewed as either faith-based or secular, and that really, you know, even for an organisation that doesn't identify as faith-based, the religious and cultural setting from which the organisation emerges strongly shapes how it conceptualizes and approaches its activities, even, as I said, if this isn't strongly articulated. And I think as researchers, if we want to think we want to do research on religion and humanitarianism, we go to the faith-based organizations when we perhaps ought to be looking across the whole sector to understand more about how religion intersects with humanitarian action. And I think this is probably much more likely to also be the case with the very local organisations where there's this binary between the religious and the secular that we're obsessed with doesn't have the same resonance. So the third area of discussion in your chapter that I found very interesting and relevant, and that I think speaks into wider debates, is the way in which the chapter raises this issue of the implicit impact of religion on the aid business as a whole, you know, as being a northern-driven activity that is rooted in a Christian culture, but is now obscured, and we now think of this as very secular. And scholars such as Jörg Haustein and Gregory Deacon have done some of this work in tracing the colonial, and others as well, the colonial and missionary roots of the development and aid business. And of course, Ella, in your chapter, you contribute here through examining the impact of the Catholic Church on the Polish aid sector, but I think also about how the moral economy of the Polish aid sector is reflective of that of the broader humanitarian world. And again, presumably, as the broader humanitarian world has its roots in a Christian influenced culture. But, you know, you've underscored the lack of research in this area. So you're right, very little actual work has been done to make these implicit connections explicit and to pinpoint specific examples of action or narratives that reflect particular forms of religiosity and religious belief in mainstream secular aid organisations. So I think this is really true, and this reminds me of Habermas's idea of crossover narratives, which emerge from both secular and religious spaces, and this has been taken up in the work of Paul Cloak and his collaborators, who are geographers but are particularly interested in looking at the faith and welfare space in the UK, and they argue that there's evidence of crossover narratives within this faith and welfare space in the UK is evidence of what they call a post-secular rapprochement. I mean, I criticize this in other places, but you know, I think, you know, some of us have been writing about how religious actors are adopting the very sort of technocratic and secular language of humanitarianism and development, but there's much less work looking at how religion influences the humanitarian sphere and what these crossover narratives are and how they operate. And finally, I was really interested in the way that you talked about the Catholic view of the family as being hierarchical and paternalistic, and I'd have loved to have heard more about this. So hierarchical and paternalistic, which appears to influence not only the Polish approach to aid, but also has resonances over the aid sector as a whole, you know, as we know, and possibly this, you know, being underpinned across the whole sector by a sort of residual influence of Christianity and its approach to charity. And, you know, and this being problematic for the ways in which this might achieve some short-term amelioration of suffering, but does little to actually transform the social structures that perpetuate it. And of course, this is problematic for aid, and there are lots of critics of this and lots of alternatives. But it sort of got me thinking, you know, and this might not be something you can answer, but maybe, you know, others here could perhaps not necessarily answer, but maybe sort of contribute some thoughts towards. It sort of got me thinking more generally about the impact of moral economies that are shaped by faith on welfare regimes, and whether or not this problem of hierarchy and paternalism is particularly an issue with Christianity, you know, and whether there are sort of resources or examples from other traditions and worldviews that might do this a bit better, you know, that might be able to underpin a moral economy of humanitarianism that goes beyond charity and that is much more sort of inclusive of other sort of worldviews and perspectives, so less hierarchical. But it was great to read this. I read it yesterday afternoon, and I came up with lots of questions, and this is only a fraction of them. But you know, I was really happy to be able to sort of locate this within the sort of broader fields of religion, humanitarianism and development as it spoke to me. But thank you very much. And I'm really, really interested to hear what others have got to say as well.
Thank you. Thank you. These are great comments, and I really appreciate them. I don't know, how should we process? Should I answer some of those, or should we welcome more questions? What would be the...
Yeah, well, I'm happy to. Do you want to take just maybe a couple of minutes to quickly answer some of those points, and then we can go to questions and answers? So just for everyone else in the group, get ready for your questions and answers.
Sure, because I would love to hear what others think, but I wanted to say that it's very, like, my path to that research for me is very telling, because when I started doing this research, I didn't look at this NGO as in any way religious NGO. And it was the, am I muted? No, okay. And it was interesting because I know that part of their process of hiding religiosity was also part of the Polish history, where they really wanted to be recognized at the EU forum. And part of the baggage and labeling that Poland, I don't know if suffers from or whatnot, is this label of Catholic country, that Poland is backward, everybody is Catholic. So everybody really tries to pretend this is not all, you know, like this is not the all that is to Poland. And that's why they were really doing it, like not one of the reasons. And then I know that it was also one of the reasons, as a, like, I had to recognize my positionality, that I am a Polish person in Cambridge doing PhD, and I was constantly asked about Polish Catholicism by my friends, scholars, colleagues from the West. And I was rolling my eyes and I was like, Jesus, people, you are obsessed with this. There is nothing to it. Until I realized there is so much to it that there is, but it's so well hidden. It is so implicit that it required a lot of reading between lines. But I think what is important in this kind of research, of how do you research implicit things? It's a tricky methodological thing. So I figured, as anthropologists, there was a lot of participant observations, me living with on the mission side, working with colleagues, following them, interviews, obviously. And things, even in interviews, people would be very worried not to mention church, and we're circling around it and avoiding the term. So a lot of it was sensed in between lines, but there is a question, how do you prove it later, right? And then actually looking at the statistics of Polish aid and excavating, when there is a partner named, what is behind that name, which sounds very secular, and who are those people and who established NGOs. So it was an interesting, methodologically also interesting research. But I do agree that there, at least I think now things are progressing and changing a little bit, but definitely at the time when I was doing fieldwork, the research on religion and development was very much about faith-based organizations, and perhaps in anthropology, looking how local religions help or hinder development processes. And of this religion, it was like people bought into the myth of modernity, that everybody who does development is a modern secular agent. But people come from somewhere, they were brought up somewhere, something shaped them. And Polish case where people emerge as donors, I was privileged and in a good moment to do that. That was a good timing for that research because I could follow it as it was unfolding. I think in the case of British, like you said, or other much more established structures, those things are there, but they are obvious for the outsider, right? The idea of charity for my Polish eyes that were born in the communism was completely foreign. And the first thing that socialism did was abolishing charitable organizations. So and looking for different ways of working internationally, locally, and with people. So, so I think to do that research in the UK, we either need or in other places, really good historians working in pair with anthropologists, but I would also say someone with a little bit of distant view, because those things are really, like, I experienced that it was very invisible to me because I was in it. I am a brought up Catholic person, and the things that I took for granted, I just didn't pay attention to them. So maybe I will stop here, and maybe there are more questions.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks. Absolutely. I mean, it is rare that it's rarer that we see, an analysis of the religious identity of a donor. As you've said, we often see an analysis of the faith-based element of organizations and what's behind that. And I think certainly with emerging donors, that's even rarer. And there's some other emerging donors that it would be worth analyzing religious identity linked with their emerging donor status a little bit more as well. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to all of you if you have any questions or comments about the work that has been presented in the conversation we've had. We're a small enough group, so please just feel free to unmute and comment.
Thank you so much, Ella and Emma, for these very interesting and challenging ways of looking at this whole subject. And I'm just wondering, making an observation here, if there's any works that have been done looking at aid workers, especially local aid workers, whether it is Sudan or Tanzania or Kenya, how they are able to live or hold the tensions of the two worlds, that this humanitarian agency may not identify with any religious, and some clearly would say religion, no. But the very aid workers are very strongly religious, that they are able to do the work in that secular, non-religious way, but at the same time are running, sometimes even running churches themselves. But they can hold those tensions together, that this is what this aid, this organization requires. I'll give you my 8 hours of not showing any religion, but I'll still be very religious and carry on my faith in another sector. Secondly, because from history with church planting or with missionary movements and colonialism, we do know that charity was always associated by missionary work. They are the ones who did the good work, quote unquote. How that has continued to influence people, that even if the humanitarian organization has nothing to do with faith or is not identifying with, but the people themselves perceive this as a charity, as mission, as connected with religion.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think these are very interesting and important points. So as for the aid workers, and I think what you seem to suggest is that the fact of working with the secular organization might create some kind of conflict for the person who might be very religious. And a few things here come to mind, that it is very interesting, like you said, that people very often, people have some forms of beliefs, views all around the world. So it is interesting to see this one industry which goes into those highly religious spaces and like erases this part of people's identity. And very often we have white people from global north coming to the global south, and people talk about differences between each other, and very often religion does come up. And actually the fact that people are have no religion is more surprising or shocking than the fact that they have some different religion, right? So I think it is something to explore. I think the reason why those organizations this specific, maybe I will speak about this specific organization's its trajectory, why it chosen to be so secular, was not only what I mentioned about the East-West tension in Europe and the struggle to establish themselves as modern Western, hence secularized, but it's also that they started their work as a clearly humanitarian organization, and they carried the first practice initiative was aid to Sarajevo. And because they were part of the international convoy, the Red Cross convoy, and they inherited and took with them those humanitarian standards as well. But there was never a conversation how to evolve from that, what to do about it. Even though some people would argue that the reason why the NGO leader Wanda pushed for the permanent mission in Palestine was so that she could go to Israel, to visit the Holy Land. So it is again like the elephant in the room. But for Janka, there was no problem. She was extremely religious person. And in the chapter, I give more examples of her connection with the Polish church and extremely visible friendship with the Polish church, public friendship, public membership in the church. Yet in her practice, she argued it has nothing to do with it. Like she was able to, at least in declarative terms, completely detach and say, and if challenged, she would say, well, yes, God is for me important and I want to be a good Christian, that's why I do it, but like the actual practice and the way I do it has nothing, like it's, like she presented herself as de-religionized in some way. And you mentioned also the other point you made was about the missionaries, those good workers, and the origins of charitable work and the history of missionary in that movement. And definitely that's something that Polish aid benefits from, this view that aid, like I tried to show in my paper, that this perception of missionaries, of Catholic missionaries as good doers is still stronger in Poland than the negative view, and it assists, it helps Polish organization to generate support, because it's support for the good doers, missionaries. As I said, it's not necessarily, it's like people feel that when they donate money, it's like at the church collection or the public fundraising, it is those who give money, they feel and they declare they're giving money to Wanda, they're giving money to the NGO. It's never, oh, I'm helping people in South Sudan to drill a borehole. It's like, I'm helping my priest because they came this Sunday and they said they're building, I don't know, a school in Rwanda. So it's helping those missionaries, not necessarily, this is how it's phrased. Yeah. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Esther, as well. Obviously within humanitarian movements at the moment, there's this shift towards localization. And Emma and I did some work last year on local faith actors in South Sudan, and there are so many different local faith actors in South Sudan with, deep traditions of assistance, like, Esther was describing, where they're also splitting their lives between the development work and then the work that they have as potentially leading a church, or the more religious work. So there are many people inhabiting this divide, and just interesting to note how the histories of the context in which they come from, be that Poland or South Sudan, is very much shaping their work. So, but anyway, not enough from me. Any other comments or questions from?
Can I comment on something here, which I also like regarding South Sudan and how people make this separation? I talk about a similar thing that happens with the people who in South Sudan, with aid workers who have military history and who want to become members, like who wants to work and be employers of the development of humanitarian workers, of organizations. And it is hard to be a young man in South Sudan in mid-2000s and not have military background because of war, because of the country history. Very often this is something that people are proud of. This is, fighting for your own independence. Yet organizations like mine and all others organizations that were in the area, they would not hire people who put on CV membership in the army. So people learned how to hide this very proud and important part of who they are and what they have achieved and done in life, in order not to be discounted. And I think a similar thing can happen with their religious affiliations, that people learn how to play the game at some point in the name of weirdly defined standard of neutrality.
Any other comments or questions from the group? Jonathan, did you put your video on to make a comment, or or not?
I see no videos.
I wasn't sure. Sorry, I just realized that I've had it off. No, sorry, but I'm just really enjoying what you're saying, and I don't have much to add, except I'm so glad for what's been said so far. So please keep going.
Okay, sorry to put you on the spot. Well, please, anyone else that we unfortunately lost Adis, who put a comment about the theological reflections. Did you want to comment on that comment in the chat, Ellen?
So I have to say that I have never been an expert in theology, and my theology is built on my weird public school education. So this was the hardest for me because in order to learn about the implicit tropes, religious tropes in the openly secular world, you have to be very skillful at knowing what you are looking for. So you have to first learn theology and all those things in order to then be able to see them. So that was, I will not even pretend that I'm a theologian and I can argue with what he said. So I'm sorry, but I do think I don't think that what I am presenting in the paper is very high profile theology. It's more like folk understanding of charity, Catholic charity and Catholic theology. How people understand their place in the world and their relation to others and their obligations to others.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think that, so I did my research from an Irish university and also looked at organizations that supported missionaries and the support for those organizations from Ireland. But then also the reality of those organizations. And I think that we do have to bring in, theory that we know from post-colonial theory and maybe some of the post-secular, all these different theories that can start to critique critical development studies, etc., that can start to critique and challenge maybe some of the ways of working that are more problematic and have not been challenged amongst some of the missionary movements. But then on the other side of that, also bring to the fore that, there's all this work happening amongst some of the missionary movements that is, in many ways, I think represents some of this localized response that the humanitarian community wants to put forward as a kind of gold standard, and that donors are struggling with, etc. at the moment, because obviously with the missionary work over decades, and the embedded, the way that missionaries have been embedded in countries for many years, that is providing kind of an alternative model to this really quick in and out kind of humanitarian response that does some material provision and then does a delivery from the back of a truck and then leaves. And so, I think it's very careful line, because I think, humanitarians mostly have quite a negative perception of missionaries, and that's what I generally hear. But there's an interesting point there where there's been work happening in parallel for many years, and both could learn from each other, unsurprisingly, that there's elements of the humanitarian professionalism that would be very useful, and then there's elements of that embedded and accompanying approach from missionaries that could be useful for the humanitarians' ways of thinking.
Yeah, I think that Ireland is not just because I lived in Ireland for a while, but Ireland was instrumental for that research, because similar to this notion of we are helping our missionaries. That's something that also happened in Ireland with Irish missionaries, right? That Irish were late to the missionary movement because of the famine, and British were first. And a similar story, like when you're helping Irish missionaries just in the middle of after the famine, how do you do that? So the idea is, how do you convince people to do it? But these are our missionaries. This is, our Connor from the village. So we have to help him rather than some strangers in a land we've never seen or heard of. But it was interesting for me as well to see. I had a student who worked also to see how church, the relationship of church with the aid organizations in Ireland, and most, if not all, of aid organizations in Ireland are Catholic, religious, quite openly religious, yet they are now trying to take away a little bit of that, like to move away from that image. And she noticed something interesting, that older aid workers were very political, and their political views and engagement was shaped by the church of the 70s, 80s, 60s, which was very political. And the younger generation, which also was influenced by the church, this political angle evaporated. So so that was interesting for me, in a similar way that in Poland, church is still very political, but it was seen as much more progressive in the 80s than it is now. So I think that's also something that is interesting to look at. But as for the, what we can learn from missionaries and what missionaries can learn from aid workers, among Polish diplomats and aid workers, there has been this strong view that they've been on the ground, they speak the language, so we can learn from them. But then again, they were included and brought into this world of aid workers, and they had to learn the game. It was very little room for them to bring their own alternatives in, because when they were bringing their own real, if you will, face, not masked yet, but the real, like this religious side of the involvement, if that was made clear and visible, there was a big red flag put that, no, we don't want to fund your missionary work. But so they had to learn the language of, the secular language, the language of NGOs. They had to learn the buzzwords in order to continue doing what they were doing. So it was interesting for me to observe, for instance, once when I was sitting at the meeting in the ministry and we were deciding funding allocations for different organizations, and there was an application and the name did not resonate anything religious or Catholic. It was just the name of the location that it was clear that it's by the church. But like when people read loads of documents, they do not go that far. They just read secular name of their organization. Fine. And then the paper was about promoting the idea of civil society, empowerment, community building. And in between lines, it was that it's about young girls and relationships. And only these organizations, which turns out to be a missionary, learned very skillfully how to mask any religious associations and hide the actual goal of the practice, which was to promote, oh my God, now I forgot the word. It was like this, the movement to make sure that the girls will not have premarital sex and that they will, and to, like it was reproductive education, right, in line with the Catholic Church. But it was so well hidden that it became a big discussion at the committee meeting. Should first to discover that and then, okay, like, is this what the Polish state wants to fund, the Catholic teaching on the family reproduction? So it is interesting how even when people we would think have a space to influence and to bring change and diversity, institutionally they are forced not to do it. Yeah.
Absolutely, that's a very interesting example, and I think that's where obviously that's going to raise many red flags about how FBOs can change their identity to write and rewrite. But of course, it's not just religious identity. There's lots of different ways where organizations are writing for the donor in their proposal while actually having quite different intentions. And yeah, it's a bit of a minefield. We've got from Laurie a comment about short-term missions, and I think there's lots to discuss here. I unfortunately we are at the hour, and I also noticed someone else join now. So I'm sorry that we had a bit of confusion about the time this week. We've had, the previous 2 weeks we've had time changes and going back and forward, and we got confused. So many apologies. I would say though that this recording will be online very shortly, and so you'll be able to listen back to the presentation, and so it's not all lost. I'd like to give a really great thanks to Ella for presenting, and then to the rest of the group, where our next session is on the 10th of December, and we'll be sending more information about that in due course. And also we're interested to get speakers for next year now. We're kind of setting up next year. So if you have a paper coming up that you'd like to present and discuss, then we'll send the link for that too as well. And I'd encourage you to sign up. So thank you very much, everyone. Sorry we've gone a little bit over time today, but it was worth it to get more conversation out. So thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.